Hi, I'm Sergeant Riley Carter. My stepmom handed me a cardboard box and said, "You don't belong here anymore. Pack your things." I'd just returned from 3 tours overseas. I hadn't even unpacked my duffel bag. They called it protecting the family assets, but it felt more like a battlefield I wasn't prepared for. And just when they thought they'd pushed me out for good, Dad's lawyer opened an envelope and said 5 words that turned my stepmom's face white as paper. She owns 60% of everything. So here's what really happened and why I never backed down. Have you ever been told you don't belong in the place you bled to protect? Tell me where you're watching from. I read every single comment. The morning I stepped off that Greyhound bus in Charleston, South Carolina, my combat boots hit southern soil for the first time in 4 years. The air was thick with humidity and sweet tea promises, nothing like the desert sand that had filled my lungs and stained my memories. I carried everything I owned in a worn canvas duffel bag that had seen more countries than most people see in a lifetime. My phone buzzed with a text from Dad. "Welcome home, sweetheart. Can't wait to see you." 3 years of delayed messages, care packages that never arrived, and video calls that cut out mid-sentence had built a wall between us that I wasn't sure how to climb. But he was my father, and I was his daughter, and that had to count for something. The house looked different as the taxi pulled up the circular driveway. Bigger somehow, with fresh white paint and manicured gardens that screamed expensive landscaping. New windows caught the afternoon sun like diamonds, and a fountain I didn't recognize bubbled cheerfully near the front steps. This wasn't the modest 2-story colonial I'd left behind when I enlisted at 18. This was a mansion trying to pretend it had always been grand. The front door opened before I could knock. Dad stood there, grayer around the temples, softer around the middle, but his smile was exactly as I remembered. He pulled me into a hug. That lasted longer than I expected, his arms trembling slightly as if he couldn't quite believe I was real. "Riley," he whispered into my hair. "My brave girl. You're finally home." Behind him, shadow moved in the hallway. Elegant, calculated, shadow. My stepmom, Vivian, appeared wearing a cream-colored dress that probably cost more than my military salary for 6 months. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a perfect chignon, not a strand out of place, and her smile was the kind that never reached her eyes. "Riley," she said, extending one manicured hand like she was greeting a business associate. What a surprise. Surprise. I'd been writing letters home for months about my discharge date. I'd called 3 weeks ago to confirm my arrival time. The only surprise here was the ice in her voice and the way she positioned herself between Dad and me like a human barrier. "Vivian," I replied, accepting her handshake briefly. Her grip was firm, practiced, the kind that said she was used to being in charge. "The house looks different." She glanced around as if seeing it for the first time. "Oh, we've made some improvements. Your father's business has been doing quite well." The way she said, "your father's business," made it clear she considered herself a partner in whatever success had built this new version of home. Dad stepped back, his arm still around my shoulders. Come in, come in. Vivian's right, things have changed quite a bit since you left. The construction company really took off after that government contract came through." Government contract. Something twisted in my stomach, but I couldn't name it yet. I followed them through a foyer that belonged in a magazine, complete with crystal chandelier and marble floors that clicked under my boots like accusations. "I'll show you to your room," Vivian said, already moving toward the staircase. "We've had to make some adjustments to accommodate the new layout." New layout. The bedrooms upstairs had been completely reconfigured. Where my childhood room used to be, there was now an office with built-in bookshelves and a mahogany desk that looked like it cost more than a car. Vivian led me to a smaller room at the end of the hall, barely larger than my military barracks. "This will work for now," she said, setting my duffel bag on a twin bed covered with generic white linens, "until you figure out your next steps." Until I figured out my next steps, as if coming home was just a temporary layover on my way to somewhere else. The room had one small window that looked out at the garage, and the walls were painted a sterile beige that reminded me of hospital corridors. "Where's all my stuff?" I asked, looking around the empty space. "My books? My photos? My desk?" Vivian's smile tightened. "We packed everything away when we renovated. I'm sure it's in storage somewhere." Somewhere. 4 years of letters, journals, childhood memories, and photographs reduced to somewhere in storage. I sat heavily on the edge of the bed, feeling the weight of deployment and displacement settling into my bones like lead. That evening at dinner, I sat at a dining room table that could seat 12, though only 3 chairs were occupied. Dad had changed into a polo shirt and khakis, looking more relaxed than I'd seen him in years. Vivian had switched to a different dress, this one navy blue with pearl buttons that caught the light from yet another crystal chandelier. "So, tell us about your plans," she said, cutting her salmon into precise, identical pieces. "I imagine you'll want to find your own place soon. Start fresh." Start fresh. I'd been starting fresh every 18 months for the past 4 years, moving from base to base, country to country, mission to mission. The idea of starting fresh again made my chest feel tight. "Actually," I said, setting down my fork, "I was hoping to stay here for a while, figure things out, maybe help with Dad's business." The silence that followed was loud enough to hear my own heartbeat. Dad looked up from his plate, something unreadable crossing his face. Vivian's knife stopped moving entirely. "Oh," she said finally, "I don't think that would work. The business is quite complex now, very specialized, not really suited for—" She paused, searching for the right words. "Someone without experience in the civilian sector." Someone without experience. I'd managed supply chains in combat zones, coordinated with international contractors, and supervised construction projects in 3 different languages. But apparently, I lacked civilian experience. "What kind of government contracts?" I pressed, looking at Dad. "Maybe I could help. I have contacts, experience with federal procurement processes." Dad's napkin found his lap, then the table, then his lap again. "It's complicated, sweetheart. Lots of moving parts, bidding processes, regulatory compliance, environmental assessments. Very technical stuff. Technical stuff. I'd built bridges in Afghanistan and coordinated infrastructure repairs in Iraq, but building in South Carolina was apparently beyond my capabilities." Vivian leaned forward slightly, her voice taking on a tone I recognized from briefings with commanding officers, who'd already made their decisions. "Riley, I think what your father is trying to say is that this business represents a significant investment of time and resources. We've built something very specific here, very carefully. Adding new variables at this point could be disruptive." Disruptive. I was a variable now, not a daughter, not a partner, not even a person with skills and experience worth considering, just a disruption to their carefully constructed new life. After dinner, I unpacked my few belongings in the sterile, beige room while their voices carried up through the vents. Vivian's words were clipped, urgent. Dad's responses were muffled, apologetic. I couldn't make out specifics, but the tone was clear enough. I was a problem to be managed, not a daughter to be welcomed home. That night, I lay on the twin bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a house that was supposed to be home. No desert wind, no generator hum, no distant sounds of helicopters or convoy engines. Just suburban silence broken occasionally by the central air conditioning cycling on and off. This wasn't the homecoming I'd imagined during those long, hot nights in forward operating bases. I'd pictured family dinners and stories shared, maybe helping Dad expand his business with my government connections and construction experience. Instead, I felt like a stranger in a house that had erased every trace of the girl who'd left 4 years ago. My high school trophies, gone. My bookshelf, gone. Even the family photos in the hallway had been updated to feature only Dad and Vivian, as if I'd never existed at all. Tomorrow, I decided I'd start asking questions. Real questions about the business, about the house, about what exactly had changed while I was overseas serving my country. Because something about Vivian's carefully worded deflections and Dad's nervous energy didn't sit right with me. In the military, we called it situational awareness, that feeling when the environment doesn't match the intelligence briefing. And right now, every instinct I'd developed in 4 years of deployment was telling me that this perfect house, this sudden wealth, this urgent need to keep me away from the family business, wasn't adding up to the story they wanted me to believe. I woke up at 500 hours out of habit, my internal clock still running on military time despite being back in civilian territory. The house was quiet except for the soft hum of expensive appliances and the distant sound of sprinklers watering, those perfect gardens. I'd slept fitfully, unused to the soft mattress after years of military cots and sleeping bags, but mostly because my mind kept circling around Vivian's carefully chosen words from the night before. The smell of coffee drew me downstairs, where I found Dad sitting at the kitchen island reading financial newspapers spread across granite countertops. He looked up when I entered, his smile warm but somehow strained around the edges. "Morning, sweetheart." "Sleep okay?" he asked, folding the Wall Street Journal and setting it aside. I noticed how quickly he moved the paper away, as if the headlines contained secrets I wasn't meant to see. "Well enough," I replied, pouring myself coffee from a machine that probably cost more than my military housing allowance. "This is quite the setup you've got here." Dad glanced around the kitchen as if seeing it through fresh eyes. Stainless steel appliances, marble everything, a wine refrigerator that hummed softly in the corner. "Vivian has excellent taste. She really transformed this place." Transformed, that was one way to put it. Erased might be more accurate. Every trace of my mother's presence had been scrubbed away and replaced with Vivian's version of sophisticated living. The handmade ceramic bowls Mom had collected were gone, replaced by sleek white dinnerware that looked like it belonged in a hotel. Her herb garden outside the kitchen window had been paved over for a decorative water feature. Vivian appeared in the doorway, wearing workout clothes that probably cost more than my dress uniform. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a high ponytail, and she carried a yoga mat under one arm like a fashion accessory. "Riley," she said with that same practiced smile, "I hope you slept well. I know the accommodations are a bit modest compared to what you might have expected." The way she said modest made it clear that my expectations were the problem, not the fact that I'd been relegated to what was essentially a guest room in my own childhood home. "Actually," I said, leaning against the counter, "I was hoping we could talk about the business today. Maybe you could show me around the office, introduce me to the team." Vivian's smile faltered for just a moment before snapping back into place. "Oh, I don't think that would be appropriate. The office is quite busy right now, and we wouldn't want to disrupt the workflow." Disrupt the workflow. I'd coordinated construction projects in active war zones, but apparently I was too disruptive for a civilian construction office in Charleston. Dad cleared his throat, not quite meeting my eyes. "Maybe in a few weeks, sweetheart. Once things settle down." Settle down from what? I wanted to ask, but Vivian was already moving toward the door. "I'm off to my Pilates class. Riley, there are some things we need to discuss when I get back. About your situation here." My situation. As if being their daughter was a temporary condition that needed to be resolved. After she left, Dad and I sat in awkward silence for several minutes. He kept glancing at his phone, checking the time, fidgeting with his coffee mug like he had somewhere important to be. Finally, he stood up and grabbed his keys from a bowl by the door. "I need to head into the office," he said, avoiding my gaze. "Maybe we can catch up more tonight." I watched him leave through the kitchen window, noting how he drove a brand new BMW that hadn't been in the driveway when I arrived. Everything about this house, this lifestyle, spoke of sudden wealth, but Dad had always been careful with money, practical to a fault. The transformation felt too dramatic, too complete. Alone in the house, I decided to do what any good soldier does when dropped into unfamiliar territory: reconnaissance. I started with the obvious places, looking for clues about how exactly Dad's modest construction company had become profitable enough to afford marble countertops and crystal chandeliers. The home office that had replaced my bedroom was locked, but the study downstairs had been left open. Inside, I found evidence of the new life Vivian had built around my father. Framed photographs showed them at charity galas, golf tournaments, and political fundraisers. In every picture, Dad looked slightly uncomfortable in his tuxedo, while Vivian glowed beside him like she'd been born for this kind of life. The bookshelf held volumes on business strategy, real estate development, and government contracting regulations. Interesting reading for a woman who'd married a small-time construction worker. I pulled out a book on federal procurement processes and found a business card tucked between the pages. Harrison & Associates, Government Relations Consulting. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Riley, it's Marcus Webb from the office. Your dad said you were back in town. Would love to catch up if you have time." Marcus had worked for Dad since before I'd enlisted, starting as an apprentice, carpenter, and working his way up to project supervisor. If anyone could tell me what had really changed while I was overseas, it would be him. I texted back suggesting we meet for lunch, and 2 hours later, I was sitting across from Marcus at a diner downtown, watching him fidget with his coffee cup the same way Dad had that morning. He looked older, more tired, with new lines around his eyes that hadn't been there when I'd left. "Good to see you, Riley," he said, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. "How are you adjusting to civilian life?" The question felt loaded, like he knew something about my homecoming that I didn't. "Still figuring it out," I admitted. "Dad's been pretty vague about the business. He mentioned a government contract." Marcus's expression darkened. "Yeah, that contract. Changed everything around here." He paused, glancing around the diner as if checking for eavesdroppers. "Look, Riley, I probably shouldn't be talking about this, but your dad's not the same man you left behind." "What do you mean?" Marcus leaned forward, lowering his voice. "That government contract didn't just fall into his lap. Vivian had connections, people who could make things happen. But the terms..." He shook his head. "Let's just say your dad signed some papers he might not have fully understood." My stomach tightened. "What kind of papers?" "Partnership agreements, profit-sharing deals, contracts that tied the business to Vivian's family in ways that can't be easily undone." Marcus stirred his coffee nervously. "There's talk around the office that she's been positioning herself to take over completely." "Take over what exactly?" I pressed. "How big has the company gotten? Big enough that your dad's signature is worth millions now. But Riley..." Marcus met my eyes directly. "I don't think he realizes how much control he's actually given up." The pieces were starting to form a picture I didn't like. A grieving widower, vulnerable and isolated after his daughter left for military service. A sophisticated woman with connections and ambitions. A business that had grown beyond anything Dad could have built on his own. When I returned to the house that afternoon, Vivian was waiting in the living room with a manila folder and the kind of expression I'd seen on commanding officers delivering bad news. She gestured to the chair across from her, and I noticed she'd positioned herself behind Dad's desk like she was conducting a performance review. "Riley, we need to discuss your plans," she began, opening the folder to reveal what looked like rental listings and apartment brochures. "I've taken the liberty of researching some options for you. There are several nice complexes near the Veterans Center, places that would be more suitable for someone starting over." Starting over. I'd been home for less than 48 hours, and she was already trying to relocate me. "I appreciate the research," I said carefully, "but I'm not ready to make any decisions about housing yet." Vivian's smile tightened. "I think you misunderstand. This isn't really a discussion about timing. It's about what's best for everyone involved." She pulled out a sheet of paper covered in her neat handwriting. I've compiled a list of reasons why independent living would benefit you more than staying here. The list was thorough. I had to give her that. Points about developing self-reliance, building civilian job skills, accessing veteran services, creating healthy boundaries. Each bullet point was carefully phrased to sound like concern for my well-being rather than what it actually was. A roadmap for getting rid of me. You've put a lot of thought into this, I observed, almost like you've been planning it for a while. Her laugh was light, practiced. Oh, Riley, I'm just trying to help. You're a capable, independent woman. You don't need to live in your childhood bedroom forever. Except it wasn't my childhood bedroom anymore. It had been converted into her office space, and I'd been relegated to what amounted to servants' quarters. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. What does Dad think about this? I asked. Vivian's expression shifted slightly, revealing something harder beneath the polished surface. Your father agrees that independence would be good for you. He's concerned about enabling dependence. Enabling dependence. I'd served 3 tours overseas, managed million-dollar equipment budgets, and led teams of soldiers through combat situations. But apparently, wanting to reconnect with my family after 4 years of military service was unhealthy dependence. I'd like to hear that from him directly, I said. Of course, Vivian replied smoothly. But he's very busy with work right now. The business demands most of his attention these days. The business that I wasn't allowed to see, managed by the woman who was systematically erasing my presence from my own family home. I stood up, leaving her rental listings scattered across the desk. I'll consider my options, I said, heading toward the stairs. But I'm not going anywhere until I understand exactly what's happened to my family while I was gone. That night, I lay in the narrow bed listening to Vivian's voice carrying through the heating vents. She was on the phone with someone. Her tone sharp and urgent. She's asking too many questions, I heard her say. We need to move faster than planned. I couldn't make out the response, but Vivian's next words came through clearly. She doesn't belong here anymore. This is our life now, and I won't let some soldier girl ruin everything we've built. Soldier girl. 4 years of service, multiple. Commendations, leadership experience that most people would never understand, and I was just a soldier girl threatening to ruin her carefully constructed new life. But as I stared at the ceiling in the dark, I realized Vivian had made one crucial mistake in her assessment. She thought I was just a displaced veteran looking for a place to belong. What she didn't know was that I was a trained investigator, with security clearance, combat experience, and a very specific set of skills for uncovering the truth in hostile territory. And right now, my own home felt like the most hostile territory I'd ever encountered. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop, staring at a photograph I'd pulled from my deployment files. It showed me and my squad standing in front of a school we'd helped rebuild in Kandahar province, our faces streaked with dust and exhaustion, but smiling because we'd just restored electricity to a building that would educate 300 Afghan children. The contrast between that moment of purpose and my current situation felt like whiplash. I'd enlisted the day after my 18th birthday, 3 months after Mom died from cancer. Dad had been lost in his grief, wandering through the house like a ghost, unable to look at anything that reminded him of her. The walls still held her artwork, her books still lined the shelves, and her coffee mug still sat in the same spot on the kitchen counter where she'd left it the morning she went to the hospital for the last time. I need to do something that matters, I'd told him the night before I left for basic training. We were sitting in the living room, surrounded by sympathy cards and casserole dishes from neighbors who didn't know what else to offer. Mom always said we should serve something bigger than ourselves. Dad had nodded, his eyes red-rimmed and distant. She'd be proud of you, sweetheart. She always said you had her sense of duty. My mother had been a nurse at the Veterans Hospital, spending her days caring for soldiers who'd come home broken in ways that weren't always visible. She'd taught me that service wasn't about glory or recognition. It was about showing up for people who needed you, even when it was hard. Basic training at Fort Benning had been a revelation. For the first time since Mom's death, I'd found a place where my strength and determination were assets rather than inconveniences. While other recruits complained about the early mornings and physical demands, I thrived on the structure and purpose. My drill sergeant, a tough woman named Staff Sergeant Martinez, had pulled me aside during week 6. "Carter, you've got natural leadership qualities," she'd said, watching me help a struggling recruit with her weapon maintenance. "But more than that, you've got something that can't be taught. You actually give a damn about the people around you." That quality had followed me through advanced individual training, where I'd specialized in logistics and supply chain management. My instructors had been impressed with my ability to see the big picture while managing countless small details, but what set me apart was my understanding that behind every supply request was a soldier who needed those resources to complete their mission and come home alive. My first deployment to Iraq had been a crash course in the reality of military service. I'd spent 14 months managing supply convoys between forward operating bases, coordinating with local contractors, and ensuring that everything from ammunition to medical supplies reached the soldiers who needed them. The work was dangerous, demanding, and absolutely crucial. One miscalculation could mean the difference between a successful mission and a tragedy. I'd written to Dad regularly during that first deployment, long letters describing the work I was doing and the people I was serving alongside. His responses had been brief but warm, updates about the construction business and promises that he was taking care of himself. Looking back now, I realized how little he'd actually told me about his day-to-day life. The letters had been full of love, but empty of details. My second deployment to Afghanistan had been even more challenging. I'd been promoted to sergeant and put in charge of a team responsible for coordinating reconstruction projects in newly secured areas. We'd worked alongside engineers, medics, and local contractors to rebuild infrastructure that had been destroyed by years of conflict. Schools, hospitals, wells that provided clean water to villages that hadn't seen running water in decades. The work had been meaningful in ways that were hard to explain to people who hadn't experienced it. Every completed project represented hope, a chance for communities to rebuild their lives and their futures. I'd found myself working 18-hour days, not because I was ordered to, but because I believed in what we were accomplishing. During that deployment, I'd received news that Dad was dating someone. His letter had been awkward, full of apologies and explanations, as if he needed my permission to find happiness again. "Her name is Vivian," he'd written. "She's helping me remember how to smile again. I think your mother would approve." I'd written back immediately, telling him how happy I was that he'd found someone. Mom had been gone for 2 years by then, and the idea of Dad finding companionship after all that loneliness had felt like a gift. I'd encouraged him to pursue the relationship, even suggesting he bring Vivian to our video calls so I could meet her. But Vivian had always been busy during our scheduled calls, business meetings, social obligations, prior commitments that seemed to align perfectly with every attempt I'd made to connect with her. Dad had been apologetic about it, explaining that she was very involved in community organizations and charitable work. "She's wonderful, Riley," he'd assured me. "You'll love her when you meet her." My third deployment had been different. I'd been selected for a special assignment working with the Corps of Engineers on a major infrastructure project, coordinating between military personnel and civilian contractors on a multi-million-dollar construction initiative. The project had been politically sensitive and logistically complex, requiring security clearance and extensive background checks. During that final deployment, Dad's letters had changed. They'd become shorter, more focused on Vivian's activities than his own. She was organizing charity events, redecorating the house, helping him expand the business. "She has such great ideas," he'd written, "connections that are really helping us grow." I'd been happy for him, proud that the business was thriving, and that he'd found someone who brought energy and ambition to his life. What I hadn't understood then was that Vivian's help had come with strings attached. The charity events were networking opportunities. The house redecorating was an erasure of my mother's memory. The business expansion was a takeover disguised as partnership. Looking back at those letters now, I could see the pattern I'd missed. While I was focused on serving my country thousands of miles away, the care packages I'd sent home had never been acknowledged. Birthday gifts I'd carefully selected during rare trips to local markets had never been mentioned in Dad's responses. Photos I'd mailed of myself and my team had apparently never arrived, though I'd sent them through military postal services that were normally reliable. I'd missed his wedding to Vivian because I'd been in the field during a critical phase of our construction project. Dad had called to tell me about it afterward, apologetic but understanding. It was a small ceremony, he'd explained. Just immediate. Family. We didn't want to make a big fuss. Immediate family. Apparently, that category hadn't included me. The most painful memory was the call I'd made after earning a commendation for excellence in logistics management. I'd been so proud, so eager to share the news with Dad. But when I'd called, Vivian had answered the phone. "Oh, Riley," she'd said, her voice politely interested but distant. "Congratulations. Your father is at a business dinner, but I'll tell him you called." Dad had never called me back. When I'd tried again a week later, he'd been distracted, hurried. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," he'd said when I told him about the commendation. "I'm so proud of you. Listen, can I call you back? We're in the middle of some important contract negotiations." He'd never called back. I'd assumed he was busy, that civilian life had its own demands. I'd made excuses for him because the alternative was too painful to consider. Now, sitting in the sterile guest room that had replaced my childhood bedroom, I understood what had really been happening during those years of service. While I'd been building schools and managing supply chains and earning commendations, Vivian had been systematically removing me from my father's life. Every unreturned call, every unacknowledged package, every missed opportunity to connect had been part of a carefully orchestrated campaign to make me irrelevant. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number for Captain Jessica Torres, my former commanding officer. She'd been a mentor during my final deployment, someone who'd understood the challenges of military service and the complexities of maintaining family relationships across distance and time. "Riley." Jessica's voice was warm and familiar when she answered. "How's civilian life treating you?" "It's complicated," I admitted. "I'm dealing with some family issues that I didn't see coming." Jessica was quiet for a moment. "Want to talk about it?" I found myself telling her everything. The changed house, Vivian's cold reception, the mysterious business expansion, the pressure to move out. Jessica listened without interrupting, the way she'd always done during our conversations about difficult missions or challenging decisions. "Riley," she said finally, "you spent 4 years learning to recognize threats and assess situations. What do your instincts tell you about this?" My instincts told me that I was being maneuvered out of my own family by someone who saw me as an obstacle to her plans. They told me that Dad was either complicit in this treatment or so thoroughly manipulated that he couldn't see what was happening. They told me that something about this sudden wealth and business expansion didn't add up. "I think I'm being played," I said. "But I don't know the endgame yet." "Then maybe it's time to do some intelligence gathering," Jessica suggested. "You're good at that. Use your skills." After we hung up, I sat in the growing darkness thinking about all the things I'd sacrificed during my years of service. Relationships with friends who'd moved on while I was overseas. Career opportunities in the civilian sector. The chance to be present during the last years of Dad's grieving process, when he'd been most vulnerable to someone like Vivian. I'd given up those things willingly because I'd believed in the mission, believed that my service mattered. But I'd also believed that home would be waiting for me when I returned. that the family I'd served to protect would still recognize me as belonging to them. The realization that I'd been wrong about that fundamental assumption felt like a betrayal deeper than any I'd experienced in combat zones. But I wasn't the same 18-year-old girl who'd left for basic training with nothing but determination and a desire to serve. I was a veteran with skills, experience, and a security clearance that had given me access to information most civilians never saw. I knew how to investigate, how to follow paper trails, how to uncover the truth when people were trying to hide it. Vivian might have thought she was dealing with a displaced soldier looking for a place to belong. What she didn't know was that she was dealing with someone who'd spent 4 years learning to fight for what mattered, even when the odds seemed impossible. The ultimatum came on a Tuesday morning, delivered with Vivian's trademark smile and a fresh cup of coffee, as if she were discussing weekend plans rather than dismantling my life. I'd been home for exactly 1 week, 7 days of growing tension and increasingly obvious hints that my presence was unwelcome. But I wasn't prepared for the clinical efficiency with which she'd planned my removal. "Riley, darling," she said, settling into the chair across from me at the breakfast table. The endearment sounded like nails on chalkboard, especially when paired with the manila folder she placed between us. "I've been doing some research and I think I've found the perfect solution for your transition period." I looked up from my laptop, where I'd been reading about government contracting regulations, trying to understand how Dad's small construction company had suddenly become profitable enough to afford a $500,000 renovation. Transition. To what exactly? Vivian opened the folder with the flourish of someone revealing a carefully planned surprise. Inside were glossy brochures for transitional housing programs, job placement services, and what looked like a lease agreement already, filled out with my name. "There's a wonderful program downtown specifically designed for veterans like yourself. Structured support, career counseling, peer mentorship. It's exactly what you need to build independence. Veterans like myself." The phrase carried implications I didn't like, as if my military service had left me damaged rather than strengthened. I flipped through the brochures, noting the emphasis on PTSD support, addiction recovery, and crisis intervention. These were programs designed for veterans who were struggling, not for someone who'd completed 4 successful deployments and earned multiple commendations. "This looks like it's for people with serious problems," I said carefully. "I'm not sure. It's appropriate for my situation." Vivian's smile never wavered. "Oh, but Riley, all veterans face challenges transitioning to civilian life. There's no shame in needing support. In fact, I think it shows tremendous self-awareness that you're open to getting help." Getting help. She was reframing my presence in my own family home as a cry for assistance, positioning herself as the caring stepmother concerned about my well-being rather than the woman systematically pushing me out. The manipulation was so smooth, I almost admired its artistry. "Where's Dad?" I asked, noting his absence from this conversation about my future. "Shouldn't he be part of this discussion?" "Your father is at an important client meeting," Vivian replied, her tone suggesting that his business obligations took precedence over family matters. "But we discussed this extensively last night. He agrees that structure and independence would be beneficial for you." Last night. I'd heard their voices through the heating vents again, a heated discussion that had lasted well past midnight. Dad's tone had been increasingly strained over the past week, and I'd noticed the way he avoided eye contact during our brief interactions. Something was wearing on him, but I couldn't tell if it was guilt over how I was being treated or pressure from Vivian to handle the Riley situation. "I'd prefer to hear that directly from him," I insisted. Vivian's expression shifted slightly, revealing a flash of irritation before the polished mask snapped back into place. "Of course, darling, but you have to understand that timing is crucial. Here, the program has limited spots and there's a waiting list. If we don't submit your application today, you might miss this opportunity entirely." Artificial urgency. It was a classic manipulation tactic, creating pressure to make a quick decision without time for careful consideration. I'd seen it used, In high-stakes negotiations during my military service, usually by people who had something to hide. "What's the rush?" I asked. "I've only been home a week. Surely there's time to explore different options." Vivian leaned forward, her voice taking on a tone of concerned sincerity that felt rehearsed. "Riley, I can see that you're struggling. The adjustment to civilian life is difficult for everyone, but it's particularly challenging for women in combat roles. The hypervigilance, the difficulty trusting people, the need to control your environment. These are all normal responses, but they're not healthy for long-term civilian relationships. Hypervigilance, difficulty trusting people, need to control my environment." She was pathologizing my entirely reasonable suspicion about her motives, turning my military-trained situational awareness into symptoms of a disorder. It was gaslighting at a professional level. "I'm not struggling," I said evenly. "I'm asking questions. There's a difference." "Exactly what I mean," Vivian replied smoothly. "This defensive posture, the assumption that people are trying to deceive you, it's a trauma response, Riley. These programs are specifically designed to help veterans work through these issues." I stared at her, realizing that she'd constructed a narrative so airtight that any resistance on my part would be interpreted as proof of her premise. If I accepted her assessment, I was admitting to psychological problems. If I rejected it, I was demonstrating the very defensiveness she claimed was evidence of trauma. "I need to think about this," I said, closing the folder. "And I need to discuss it with Dad directly." Vivian's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course. But Riley, there's something else we need to address." She pulled out another document, this one official-looking with legal letterhead. "The house is being refinanced as part of a business expansion. The insurance company requires that all occupants be listed on the policy, and there are some complications with adding you." I scanned the document, noting the complex language about liability, coverage limitations, and risk assessments. "What kind of complications?" "Well, with your military background, there are concerns about PTSD-related incidents. Insurance companies are very cautious about covering veterans, especially those who've seen combat. The premiums would be astronomical if we added you to the policy." Another layer of manipulation, using my service record against me. She was suggesting that my presence in the house was not only unwelcome, but financially burdensome, a liability that threatened the security of their new lifestyle. "This doesn't sound right," I said. "I've never had any incidents. My service record is exemplary." "I'm sure it is, darling, but insurance companies operate on statistics and risk models, not individual cases. They see combat veteran and immediately assume liability issues." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of Dad's BMW pulling into the driveway. Vivian immediately gathered the documents, but not before I caught sight of a signature line with Dad's name already filled in. Whatever was happening here had already been decided without my input. Dad entered through the kitchen door, his tie loosened and his hair disheveled in a way that suggested a stressful day. He looked older than I remembered, tired in a way that went deeper than simple fatigue. When he saw Vivian and me sitting at the table, his expression became guarded. "How did the client meeting go?" Vivian asked, standing to greet him with a kiss on the cheek. "Fine," Dad replied, but his tone suggested otherwise. He glanced at the folder in Vivian's hands, then at me. "What's this about?" "Just discussing Riley's options," Vivian said lightly. "The transitional housing program I mentioned. She's very interested." I opened my mouth to correct her, but Dad was already nodding, his relief visible. "That sounds like a good idea, sweetheart. Structure might be helpful during the adjustment period." The word adjustment stung. 4 years of successful military service, multiple commendations, leadership experience, and he saw me as someone who needed help adjusting to normal life. Either he genuinely believed I was struggling, or Vivian had convinced him that my presence was a problem that needed to be managed. "Dad, Can we talk privately? I asked. I have some questions about the business, about what's been happening while I was deployed. Something flickered across his face, anxiety mixed with what might have been guilt. Maybe later, sweetheart. I have some calls to make, and then Vivian and I have dinner plans. Dinner plans. On a Tuesday night, when we hadn't had a single family meal together since I'd been home. The message was clear. Their life had established rhythms that didn't include me, schedules that wouldn't be disrupted by my presence. That evening, alone in the house while they attended another of their social obligations, I called Marcus again. He answered on the second ring, his voice cautious when he heard mine. Riley, everything okay? Not really, I admitted. I need to ask you something, and I need an honest answer. Is Dad in some kind of trouble? The silence that followed was long enough to confirm my suspicions. When Marcus finally spoke, his voice was careful, measured. Trouble might not be the right word, but he's definitely in over his head. What does that mean? It means he signed contracts he didn't fully understand, took on partnerships that put him at a disadvantage, and now he's locked into agreements that benefit other people more than they benefit him. Other people. Vivian and her mysterious connections, the government relations consultants whose business card I'd found, the network of influence that had transformed Dad's modest construction company into something profitable enough to afford, marble countertops and BMW payments. How bad is it? I asked. Bad enough that he can't make decisions about his own business anymore. Bad enough that he's scared to rock the boat. And Riley, Marcus paused. Bad enough that he can't afford to have anyone asking too many questions right now. I was the one asking questions. I was the liability, the risk factor, the person whose presence threatened whatever carefully balanced arrangement Vivian had constructed around my father's business and personal life. After I hung up, I sat in the narrow guest room staring at the lease agreement Vivian had prepared for me. The transitional housing program was real, the paperwork legitimate. She'd done her research, found a respectable program that would solve her Riley problem while maintaining the appearance of caring about my well-being. But as I read through the terms, I realized something that Vivian had overlooked in her careful planning. The program required a detailed background check, including military service records and security clearance information. Information that would reveal exactly what kind of work I'd been doing overseas, what level of access I'd had to classified information, and what skills I'd developed during 4 years of government service. If Vivian wanted to treat me like a liability that needed to be managed, she was about to discover that some liabilities came with unexpected capabilities. I pulled out my laptop and began typing an email to my former commanding officer, requesting copies of my service records and contact information for the military lawyers I'd worked with on government contracting issues. If I was going to be forced out of my own family, I was going to understand exactly why first. And if Dad was in trouble, if he'd been manipulated into agreements that were harming him, then maybe it was time to put my security clearance and investigative training to use in a way that mattered more than any mission I'd ever undertaken. Overseas, the transition they were forcing on me wasn't going to be the one they'd planned. The kindness came from the most unexpected source. Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield, the elderly neighbor who lived in the Victorian house next door. I'd been sitting on the front porch at dawn, drinking coffee and watching the sunrise while trying to process the ultimatum Vivian had delivered the day before. The morning air was cool and sweet, with the scent of magnolias, a stark contrast to the tension that had filled the house since my arrival. Mrs. Whitfield appeared at the property line between our yards, wearing a faded floral housecoat and carrying a watering can that looked older than I was. She moved slowly, but deliberately, tending to a row of rose bushes that bordered both properties. When she noticed me on the porch, she paused and offered a tentative wave. "You must be Thomas's daughter," she called out, her voice carrying the distinctive cadence of old Charleston society. "The one who's been serving overseas." I stood and walked closer to the fence, grateful for any interaction that didn't involve manipulation or hidden agendas. "Yes, ma'am. Riley Carter. I've been in the Army for the past 4 years." Mrs. Whitfield set down her watering can and studied me with sharp blue eyes that seemed to take in everything. "I thought so. You have your mother's posture, the way you hold your shoulders." Grace always stood like she was ready for anything. The mention of my mother caught me off guard. I hadn't realized Mrs. Whitfield had known her well enough to remember such details. "You knew my mom?" "Oh, honey, Grace and I were dear friends for years. She used to bring me vegetables from her garden, and I'd share my roses with her. We'd sit on this very porch in the evenings and talk about everything under the sun." Mrs. Whitfield's expression grew sad. "I missed her terribly when she passed. Your father was so lost after that." Something in her tone suggested there was more to the story. "It must have been difficult for everyone," I said carefully. Mrs. Whitfield glanced toward the house, then back at me. "Would you like to come over for some proper coffee? I was just about to make a fresh pot, and I have some things that belong to your mother. I've been meaning to give them to your father, but—" She trailed off, leaving the sentence hanging. 20 minutes later, I was sitting in Mrs. Whitfield's sun-drenched kitchen, surrounded by the comfortable clutter of someone who'd lived in the same house for decades. Photographs covered every surface, books were stacked in corners, and the air smelled like vanilla and old roses. She poured coffee from a vintage percolator into delicate china cups that probably cost more than my monthly military pay. "Your mother used to sit right where you're sitting," Mrs. Whitfield said, settling into the chair across from me. "She'd come over when she needed to think, especially toward the end when she was so worried about leaving you and your father behind." She reached into a wooden box on the counter and pulled out a stack of letters tied with a blue ribbon. She wrote these during her final weeks. Letters to you for different occasions. Your graduation, your wedding, birthdays she knew she'd miss. My throat tightened as I recognized my mother's careful handwriting on the envelopes. Some were marked for Riley's 21st birthday, or when Riley gets married, or simply when Riley needs her mother. There were at least a dozen letters, each one representing a moment my mother had wanted to share with me despite knowing she wouldn't be there. "Why didn't Dad give these to me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Whitfield's expression grew troubled. "I gave them to him, right after the funeral. He promised he'd share them with you when the time was right. But then you left for the military, and he was so consumed with grief." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "And then Vivian came along, and things changed." The way she said Vivian's name carried a weight of disapproval that was unmistakable. Mrs. Whitfield had clearly witnessed the transformation of my father and our family from her vantage point next door. "What kind of changes?" I asked. Mrs. Whitfield stood and walked to the window that overlooked our backyard. "At first, I was happy for Thomas. He needed companionship, someone to help him through the grief. Vivian seemed charming enough, always, bringing him meals and encouraging him to get out of the house." She pointed toward what used to be my mother's herb garden, now paved over and replaced with an ornate fountain. "But then small things started disappearing. Your mother's wind chimes, her garden stones, the bird bath she'd painted herself. Vivian said they were too sad, too much of a reminder of the past." I followed her gaze, noting other changes I'd been too overwhelmed to catalog during my first week home. The old oak tree where Mom had hung a tire swing had been cut down. The vegetable garden where she'd grown tomatoes and peppers had been replaced with decorative grasses that required no maintenance. Even the mailbox, which Mom had decorated with hand-painted flowers, had been replaced with a sleek modern design that matched the house's new aesthetic. "It wasn't just the physical things," Mrs. Whitfield continued. "Vivian had opinions about everything. Your father's clothes weren't sophisticated enough. His friends weren't the right kind of people. His business wasn't ambitious enough. She had ideas for improvements, connections that could help him grow." Mrs. Whitfield returned to her chair and pulled out another item from the wooden box, a business card for Harrison and Associates, Government Relations Consulting. It was identical to the one I'd found in Dad's study. Vivian's brother owns this company, she said, watching my reaction carefully. He specializes in helping small businesses win government contracts. Very lucrative work, apparently. The pieces were starting to connect in ways I didn't like. A grieving widower with a small construction company, a sophisticated woman with family connections to government contracting, a sudden influx of wealth that coincided with major lifestyle changes. Mrs. Whitfield, I said slowly, do you know anything specific about Dad's business dealings with this company? She was quiet for a long moment, staring into her coffee cup. When she looked up, her expression was grave. Your father didn't want to take on government work initially. He said it was too complicated, too much paperwork and regulation for a small operation like his. But Vivian convinced him it was the smart thing to do, the only way to build real wealth. And now he works constantly, travels to job sites he never used to handle, deals with stress levels that would have killed him 5 years ago. But the money is good, very good. Good enough to afford all those renovations, the new cars, the country club membership. Country club membership. That explained the golf tournament photos I'd seen in Dad's study, the formal dinner events, the social obligations that kept him away from home most evenings. Mrs. Whitfield reached across the table and touched my hand gently. Riley, I don't want to speak ill of your stepmother, but I've been watching from next door for 3 years now. Your father isn't the same man he was when your mother was alive. He's not even the same man he was during those first months of grief. What do you mean? He used to make his own decisions, even when they weren't perfect. He used to have opinions about things, preferences, ideas for how he wanted to live his life. Now, she shrugged sadly. Now he asks Vivian about everything. What to wear, what to eat, who to associate with, how to spend his money. The picture she was painting was of a man who'd been gradually stripped of his agency, his independence replaced with dependence on someone who claimed to have his best interests at heart. It was a subtle form of control, the kind that happened so slowly the victim didn't realize they were being managed until it was too late to resist. There's something else, Mrs. Whitfield said, glancing toward the window again. About 6 months ago, your father came over here very upset. He'd been drinking, which isn't like him at all. He said he'd signed papers he didn't understand, that Vivian had assured him they were routine business documents. What kind of papers? He wouldn't say specifically, but he kept talking about percentages and ownership stakes. He said he'd trusted her brother's advice about structuring the business for tax purposes, but now he was worried he'd given up more control than he'd intended. Ownership stakes. The phrase sent a chill through me as I remembered Vivian's urgency about moving me out of the house. If Dad had signed agreements that affected ownership of the business or property, my presence as his daughter might complicate whatever arrangement they'd constructed. Mrs. Whitfield stood and walked to an antique secretary desk in the corner of the room. She pulled out a manila folder and handed it to me. I probably shouldn't be showing you this, but your mother would want you to know the truth. Inside the folder were photographs she'd taken from her upstairs window over the past 3 years. Images of expensive cars visiting the house at odd hours. Men in suits carrying briefcases and legal documents. Construction trucks from companies I didn't recognize working on projects that seemed far beyond the scope of normal home renovation. I started documenting things when I realized how much was changing, she explained. At first, it was just curiosity about the renovation work. But then I noticed patterns. The same people visiting repeatedly, always when your father wasn't home. Meetings that lasted for hours, with Vivian taking notes and making phone calls afterward. One photograph showed Vivian on the back patio, talking animatedly on her phone while gesturing toward legal documents spread across the outdoor table. Her expression was intense, focused, nothing like the polished socialite persona she presented to Dad and me. Mrs. Whitfield, I said carefully, why are you showing me all this? Her answer was immediate and direct. Because your mother asked me to watch out for you and your father if anything happened to her. She was worried about what would happen to Thomas during his grief, how vulnerable he might be to people with their own agendas. She stood and walked to the window again, her gaze fixed on my father's house. I failed her where Thomas is concerned. He was so lost after Grace died, so grateful for any attention or affection, that he couldn't see what was really happening. But you're different, Riley. You have your mother's strength and your own experience dealing with complicated situations. The weight of her words settled over me like a mantle of responsibility. Mrs. Whitfield wasn't just sharing information. She was passing along a mission my mother had entrusted to her. Watch out for Dad. Protect him from people who might take advantage of his grief and loneliness. What do you think I should do? I asked. Mrs. Whitfield smiled for the first time since I'd arrived, and I caught a glimpse of the woman who'd been my mother's confidant and friend. I think you should do what you were trained to do in the Army. Gather intelligence, assess the situation, and develop a strategy to protect what matters. As I walked back to the house with my mother's letters, tucked safely in my jacket, I realized that Mrs. Whitfield had given me something more valuable than kindness or sympathy. She'd given me validation that my instincts were correct, documentation that supported my suspicions, and most importantly, a sense of purpose that went beyond my own displaced feelings. I wasn't just a veteran struggling to find her place in civilian life. I was a daughter with a mission to protect her father from people who'd taken advantage of his vulnerability, and for the first time since I'd come home, I felt like I had the tools and motivation to fight back. The investigation began that same afternoon, fueled by the intelligence Mrs. Whitfield had provided and my mother's letters, which I'd read in their entirety while sitting on the narrow bed in my temporary quarters. Each letter had been a dagger of love and wisdom from beyond the grave, but one in particular had contained advice that felt almost prophetic. Remember, sweetheart, when people show you who they are through their actions, believe them the first time. Don't make excuses for behavior that doesn't align with someone's words. I started with what military strategists call open-source intelligence, information that was publicly available but required systematic analysis to reveal patterns. Using my laptop and the skills I'd developed during classified briefings, I began mapping the connections between Vivian's family, Harrison and Associates, and the government contracts that had transformed Dad's modest business into a luxury-funded operation. The Harrison and Associates website was professionally designed but deliberately vague about their specific services. Phrases like strategic government relations, regulatory compliance consulting, and public-private partnership facilitation dominated their service descriptions. The staff page listed James Harrison as senior partner, with a photograph that showed a man who shared Vivian's sharp features and calculating eyes. A deeper search revealed that Harrison and Associates had been involved in several high-profile government contracting scandals over the past decade. Nothing that had resulted in criminal charges, but enough ethical gray areas and conflict of interest allegations to paint a picture of a company that operated in the spaces between legal and questionable. I pulled up the database access I still maintained through my veteran status and began cross-referencing government contract awards in the Charleston area over the past 3 years. The patterns that emerged were troubling. Carter Construction, Dad's company, had been awarded a series of increasingly lucrative contracts, but always in partnership with larger firms that had existing relationships with Harrison and Associates. The first contract had been relatively small, renovation work on a federal courthouse that should have gone to a larger, more established company. But Carter Construction had somehow secured the subcontracting agreement, with Harrison and Associates listed as their regulatory compliance consultant. The profit margins on the project had been substantial, more than enough to fund the initial house renovations. Each subsequent contract had followed the same pattern. Projects that Dad's company wasn't technically qualified to handle on their own, partnerships with larger firms that needed local subcontractors, and Harrison and Associates collecting consulting fees from both sides of the arrangement. It was a sophisticated system that generated legitimate profits while creating layers of dependence and obligation. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "This is Elena Rodriguez, Marcus's sister. He said you might want to talk to someone who used to work in your dad's office. Can you meet me for coffee this afternoon?" 3 hours later, I was sitting across from Elena in a quiet cafe downtown, watching her nervously stir sugar into her espresso while glancing periodically toward the door as if she expected to be followed. She was younger than Marcus, probably mid-20s, with the kind of professional appearance that suggested she'd moved on to better opportunities since leaving Dad's company. "Marcus said you're asking questions about what's been happening with your father's business," she began, keeping her voice low despite the ambient noise of the busy cafe. "I worked there for 2 years as an administrative assistant, until about 6 months ago." "Why did you leave?" I asked. Elena's expression darkened. "Because I was told to do things that didn't feel right. Filing documents that bypassed normal approval processes, scheduling meetings that your father wasn't supposed to know about, handling correspondence that was marked confidential from Vivian's brother." She pulled out her phone and showed me photographs she'd apparently taken secretly while still employed at the company. The images showed financial documents, contract agreements, and what appeared to be organizational charts that listed Vivian as a managing partner despite her not being an employee. "Your father signed a partnership agreement about 18 months ago," Elena explained. "Vivian convinced him it was necessary for tax purposes and liability protection. But the way it was structured, she gained significant control over business decisions, especially regarding government contracts." I studied the organizational chart more closely, noting that Vivian's position gave her authority over contract negotiations, financial planning, and personnel decisions. Dad was still listed as majority owner, but his actual power seemed limited to day-to-day operations and client relations. "What about these meetings he wasn't supposed to know about?" I pressed. "Vivian would schedule conference calls with her brother and other people from Harrison and Associates during times when your father was on job sites. They'd discuss upcoming contract opportunities, bidding strategies, and what they called positioning initiatives." Elena showed me another photograph, this one of a whiteboard covered with what looked like a strategic planning session. Dad's company was listed alongside several other small construction firms, all connected by lines to Harrison and Associates and various government agencies. "It looked like they were building a network," Elena continued. "Small companies that could be used to win contracts, with Harrison and Associates collecting fees from everyone while maintaining plausible deniability about any coordination between the firms." The scope of what Elena was describing went far beyond simple business consulting. This sounded like a systematic effort to manipulate government contracting processes, using Dad's company as one component in a larger scheme designed to generate profits for Vivian's family. "Elena," I said carefully, "do you still have access to any of these documents?" She shook her head quickly. "They made me sign a non-disclosure agreement when I left, very detailed, with specific penalties for sharing company information, but..." She hesitated, glancing around the cafe again. "I made copies of some things before I resigned. Nothing that would violate my NDA directly, but information that might help you understand what your father got involved in." 20 minutes later, Elena had transferred a series of files to a secure cloud storage account I'd set up using encryption protocols from my military training. The documents painted a picture of systematic manipulation that had begun almost immediately after Vivian entered Dad's life. The earliest documents showed modest proposals for business expansion, reasonable suggestions for pursuing government work that aligned with Dad's existing capabilities. But as the relationship progressed, the proposals became more aggressive, involving partnerships and agreements that steadily transferred control away from Dad and toward Vivian and her family's network. One document particularly caught my attention: a memo from James Harrison to Vivian discussing long-term positioning strategies and succession planning for Dad's company. The language was clinical, treating Dad not as a partner, but as an asset to be managed and eventually replaced. After Elena left, I spent the rest of the afternoon analyzing the documents and cross-referencing them with the public records I'd accessed earlier. The pattern that emerged was clear and disturbing. Dad hadn't just been manipulated into a romantic relationship. He'd been systematically targeted as part of a business acquisition strategy. Vivian's courtship hadn't been about love or companionship. It had been about gaining control of a small construction company with the potential to win government contracts, then using that company as a foundation for building a larger network of influence and profit. My phone rang as I was reviewing the financial projections that showed how Dad's company would be gradually absorbed into Harrison and Associates' broader operations. The caller ID showed Dad's office number. Riley? His voice sounded strained, exhausted. Can you come down to the office? I need to talk to you about something. The request surprised me, given how carefully Vivian had kept me away from the business operations. Is everything okay, Dad? Can you come? It's important. He gave me an address that wasn't the original location of his construction company, but rather a modern office building in the downtown business district. The kind of place that housed law firms and consulting companies, not construction contractors. 30 minutes later, I was standing in front of a gleaming office suite with Carter Construction and Associates, printed on frosted glass doors. The reception area looked like it belonged to a Fortune 500 company, complete with leather furniture, abstract artwork, and a receptionist who looked like she'd stepped out of a corporate magazine. Dad emerged from a corner office looking haggard and older than his years. His usually neat appearance was disheveled, his tie loosened, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and constant stress. "Thank you for coming," he said, leading me toward his office. "I wasn't sure you would, given how things have been at home." The office was impressive but felt impersonal, like a movie set designed to look successful rather than a workspace where real decisions were made. Family photos on the desk showed only Dad and Vivian. The pictures of me from my military service were nowhere to be seen. "Dad, what's going on?" I asked, settling into a chair across from his desk. "You sounded upset on the phone." He was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands folded on the desk. When he finally looked up, I saw something I hadn't seen since Mom's funeral: genuine fear. "Riley, I think I may have made some serious mistakes," he said slowly. "Business decisions that seemed smart at the time, but now," he gestured helplessly around the expensive office, "I'm not sure I understand what I've agreed to anymore." The admission hung in the air between us like a confession. For the first time since I'd been home, Dad was acknowledging that something was wrong, that the perfect life Vivian had constructed around him might not be what it appeared to be. "What kind of mistakes?" I prompted gently. He pulled out a thick folder of legal documents and spread them across the desk. "Partnership agreements, loan documents, guarantees I signed for projects I don't completely understand." Vivian said her brother could help me navigate the complexity of government contracting, but these papers— He shook his head. "I feel like I signed away my independence without realizing it." I leaned forward to examine the documents, recognizing some of them from Elena's photographs, but seeing them now in their complete context. The agreements were even more problematic than I'd realized, with clauses that gave Harrison and Associates increasing control over Dad's company as their partnership deepened. "Dad," I said carefully, "how much of this did you understand when you signed it?" His laugh was bitter, hollow. "Honestly, very little. I trusted Vivian, and I trusted her brother's expertise. They said it was all standard business practice, necessary for competing in the government contracting space." Trust. The word that had been weaponized against a grieving widower who'd been isolated from his support systems and convinced that his own judgment was inadequate. I felt a surge of anger, not at Dad, but at the people who'd taken advantage of his vulnerability. We need to get you some independent legal advice, I said. Someone who can review these agreements and explain your options. Dad's expression became even more troubled. That's just it, Riley. I'm not sure I can afford to challenge any of this. The business is successful now, but it's all tied up in these partnerships and agreements. If I rock the boat, I could lose everything. Everything. The house, the lifestyle, the financial security that Vivian had convinced him was the result of smart business decisions. But I was beginning to suspect that Dad's prosperity was more fragile than it appeared, dependent on maintaining relationships with people who had their own agendas. The invitation arrived 3 days after my conversation, with Dad in his office, delivered by hand in an elegant cream envelope with gold embossing. Inside, expensive cardstock announced the annual Charleston Business Excellence Awards Gala, an event celebrating the city's most successful entrepreneurs and their contributions to economic development. Dad's name appeared prominently on the list of honorees scheduled to receive recognition for outstanding achievement in government contracting innovation. Vivian presented the invitation over breakfast with the kind of theatrical excitement that suggested she'd been planning this moment for weeks. "Isn't this wonderful, darling?" she said to Dad, who was reading the invitation with an expression that mixed pride with anxiety. Thomas Carter, honored alongside Charleston's most distinguished business leaders. She turned to me with a smile. That didn't reach her eyes. "Of course, Riley, this is a very exclusive event. Black tie, invitation only. I'm sure you understand it's not really—" She paused delicately. "Well, it's not really the kind of gathering where family members are typically included unless they're directly involved in the business." The message was clear. I wasn't welcome. This was Vivian's opportunity to present Dad as her creation, her success story, without the complication of his veteran daughter asking uncomfortable questions about how exactly this transformation had occurred. But Dad surprised both of us. "Actually," he said slowly, not looking up from the invitation, "I'd like Riley to come. She should see what we've built here." The word "we" hung in the air awkwardly, and I noticed how Vivian's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly before her smile snapped back into place. "Of course," she said smoothly. "How thoughtful of you, Thomas. Riley, you'll need something appropriate to wear. This is Charleston's premier business event, not a casual affair." Her tone suggested that my military dress uniform wouldn't be suitable, despite the fact that it was probably the most formal outfit I owned. The next 2 days were spent in a strange dance of preparation and tension. Vivian insisted on taking me shopping for appropriate attire, a process that felt more like psychological warfare than fashion consultation. Every dress she selected seemed designed to make me look either inappropriately young or awkwardly out of place among Charleston's business elite. "You want something that suggests professional competence without drawing too much attention," she explained while holding up a conservative navy dress that looked like it belonged on a funeral director. "This event is about celebrating your father's achievements, not making statements about your own experiences." My experiences, as if 4 years of military service were something to be downplayed rather than honored. I eventually selected a simple black dress that was elegant without being flashy, appropriate without being forgettable, something that would allow me to blend into the background while observing the dynamics of the world Vivian had created around my father. The Charleston Harbor Club was everything I'd expected from the city's most exclusive venue. Soaring ceilings, crystal chandeliers, and walls lined with portraits of distinguished members dating back to the antebellum period. The guest list read like a directory of political and business influence, with mayors, congressmen, and CEOs mingling over champagne and carefully crafted hors d'oeuvres. Dad looked uncomfortable in his rented tuxedo, constantly adjusting his bow tie and checking his watch as if he were timing his escape. Vivian, meanwhile, glowed in a burgundy evening gown that probably cost more than my military salary for a month. She moved through the crowd with practiced ease, introducing Dad to influential contacts and positioning him for photographs with local politicians. I found myself relegated to the sidelines, holding a glass of champagne I wasn't drinking while watching the carefully orchestrated performance of Dad's new life. Several people approached me during the cocktail hour, curious about my connection to the evening's honoree. "You must be so proud of your father's success," commented a woman whose jewelry probably cost more than most people's cars. "The transformation of Carter Construction has been remarkable to watch." Another guest, a man who introduced himself as a city councilman, was more direct in his questioning. "I understand you served overseas. That must have been difficult, missing your father's business expansion." Missing his business expansion. As if my military service had been a choice, to abandon family responsibilities rather than a commitment to serving my country. Each conversation felt like a small test, an assessment of whether I belonged in this world of carefully managed success and strategic networking. The breaking point came during the awards ceremony itself. Dad was called to the stage to receive his recognition, and as he stood behind the podium holding his crystal trophy, the presenter began reading a biography that bore only passing resemblance to the man I knew. "Thomas Carter represents the very best of American entrepreneurship," the presenter announced to polite applause. "Through innovative partnerships and strategic vision, he has transformed a small family business into one of Charleston's most successful government contracting firms. Strategic vision. Innovative partnerships." The language was corporate speak, designed to obscure the reality of how Dad's success had actually been achieved. I watched from my table as Vivian beamed from the front row, accepting congratulations from nearby guests as if she were sharing in the recognition. "Mr. Carter's commitment to excellence and community service exemplifies the values that make Charleston's business community exceptional," the presenter continued. "We are honored to recognize not just his professional achievements, but his dedication to family and the principles that have guided his remarkable journey." Family. Dedication to family. I looked around the room, noting how many guests were accompanied by spouses, children, and extended family members who shared in their moment of recognition. At Dad's table, Vivian held court like a queen, but there was no mention of his daughter who had served overseas, no acknowledgement of the family that had existed before his transformation into Charleston's newest business success story. When Dad stepped to the microphone to give his acceptance speech, I expected the usual corporate platitudes about teamwork and community support. Instead, his first words caught everyone off guard, including Vivian. "Thank you for this recognition," he began, his voice carrying through the elegant ballroom. "But I have to be honest with you. 3 years ago, I was a small-time contractor who barely understood the difference between a government RFP and a grocery list." Nervous laughter rippled through the audience, but Dad's expression remained serious. "The success you're celebrating tonight didn't come from my strategic vision or innovative partnerships. It came from trusting people who promised to help me navigate a world I didn't understand." I watched Vivian's smile become fixed, frozen in place as Dad continued speaking off script. "I signed documents I didn't read carefully enough. I entered into agreements I didn't fully comprehend. I let other people make decisions about my business because I was convinced that my own judgment wasn't sophisticated enough for the level of success they promised." The room had gone completely quiet, the polite chatter dying away as guests realized they were witnessing something unplanned and potentially explosive. "Tonight, I'm receiving an award for achievements that aren't entirely my own, in front of people who represent a world I'm not sure I belong in." Dad paused, his eyes finding mine across the crowded room. "My daughter Riley just returned from 4 years of military service. She served 3 tours overseas, managed complex logistics operations, and earned commendations for excellence under the most difficult circumstances imaginable." A murmur went through the crowd as people turned to look at me. I felt heat rising in my cheeks, uncertain whether Dad was about to praise my service or use it to make some larger point about sacrifice and success. Riley came home to find that I'd changed everything about our family's life without consulting her, without considering how my decisions might affect the only family I have left. His voice began to crack slightly. She's been asking questions about my business, trying to understand what happened while she was serving our country. And instead of welcoming her home and helping her understand, I've let her be treated like an inconvenience. The silence in the room was deafening. Vivian's face had gone pale, her carefully maintained composure finally showing cracks as she realized that Dad was publicly acknowledging problems with their carefully constructed narrative. So while I'm grateful for this recognition, Dad continued, I think it's important to acknowledge that success built on foundations you don't understand isn't really success at all. It's just expensive confusion. He held up the crystal trophy, examining it as if seeing it clearly for the first time. I'm not sure I deserve this award, and I'm not sure the man I've become deserves the respect you're showing him tonight. What happened next felt like it occurred in slow motion. Vivian stood abruptly from her front row seat, her chair scraping loudly against the marble floor. She moved toward the exit with quick, determined steps, her burgundy gown trailing behind her. Like spilled wine, several guests turned to watch her departure, their faces showing the kind of fascination that comes from witnessing a carefully orchestrated event spinning out of control. But before she could reach the ballroom doors, a voice called out from the back of the room. Mrs. Carter, perhaps you'd like to respond to your husband's comments? The question came from a woman I didn't recognize, someone who was holding what appeared to be a voice recorder and had the unmistakable bearing of a journalist. Vivian stopped abruptly, her back still turned to the room. When she finally faced the crowd, her expression had hardened into something I'd never seen before. Raw anger barely contained beneath a veneer of social propriety. I think my husband is overwhelmed by the recognition he's receiving tonight, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent ballroom. Success can be disorienting for people who aren't accustomed to it. The condescension in her tone was unmistakable, and I watched Dad's face change as he heard his own wife dismiss his moment of honesty as inadequacy rather than courage. Perhaps, Vivian continued, this is why some people are better suited to taking orders than making decisions. Military training, while admirable, doesn't necessarily prepare someone for the complexities of civilian business success. Her gaze found mine across the room, and the message was clear. She was talking about me, suggesting that my questions and concerns stemmed from an inability to understand the sophisticated world she'd created. That was the moment everything changed. Not because of what Vivian said about me, but because of what her words revealed about how she really viewed Dad. Not as a partner or an equal, but as someone whose natural limitations required her guidance and management. Someone who was lucky to have her expertise rather than someone who deserved respect for his own achievements. I stood up from my table, the scrape of my chair echoing through the silent ballroom. Every eye in the room turned toward me as I began walking toward the stage, my black dress feeling like armor and my military training providing the confidence to move with purpose through a crowd of people who suddenly felt like an audience, rather than observers. Excuse me, I said, my voice carrying clearly through the marble-walled space. I think there's been a misunderstanding about who exactly doesn't belong here tonight. The silence that followed my words stretched through the ballroom like a held breath. Every face was turned toward me as I stood beside my table, the crystal chandeliers casting light that seemed to sharpen every detail of the moment. Vivian's expression had frozen into something between shock and fury, while Dad gripped the podium, as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. My father is right about one thing, I said, my voice steady and clear in the marble-walled space. Success built on foundations you don't understand isn't really success. It's manipulation disguised as partnership. I took a step closer to the stage, feeling the weight of 4 years of military training in my posture, the confidence that came from leading soldiers through situations far more dangerous than a room full of Charleston's business elite. But he's wrong about not deserving recognition. Thomas Carter built a successful construction company through 30 years of honest work, fair dealing, and genuine expertise. What he doesn't deserve is to have that legacy used as a stepping stone for other people's ambitions. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as guests began to understand that they were witnessing something far more significant than a family disagreement. This was the unraveling of carefully constructed narratives, the exposure of hidden agendas that had been operating beneath the surface of Charleston's business community. Vivian found her voice, stepping forward with the kind of aggressive confidence that had probably served her well in previous confrontations. "Riley, you're embarrassing yourself and your father. Perhaps the stress of civilian adjustment is affecting your judgment more than you realize." The patronizing tone was identical to the one she'd used at home, the same strategy of pathologizing any challenge to her authority. But here, in front of 300 witnesses, the manipulation was transparent in a way that felt almost liberating. "Civilian adjustment," I repeated, letting the phrase hang in the air. "You mean the adjustment to discovering that my father's business success is actually controlled by Harrison and Associates, a government relations firm owned by your brother? The adjustment to learning that the partnership agreements Dad signed essentially transferred operational control to people who weren't even employees of his company?" The effect of my words was immediate and electric. Heads turned throughout the ballroom as guests began connecting dots they hadn't previously noticed. Harrison and Associates was a known entity in Charleston's political circles, and several people in the room had clearly dealt with them in various capacities. Dad stepped away from the podium, his face pale, but his expression shifting from confusion to something approaching clarity. "Riley, how do you know about the partnership agreements?" I pulled out my phone and showed him the photographs Elena had shared, documents that detailed the systematic transfer of control from Carter Construction to Vivian's family network. Because I did what I was trained to do in the military. I investigated. I gathered intelligence. I documented patterns of behavior that didn't match the official narrative. I turned to address the room more broadly. "Ladies and gentlemen, you're celebrating a man who was systematically manipulated into surrendering control of his own company by people who used his grief and loneliness as weapons against him." Vivian's composure finally cracked completely. "You have no idea what you're talking about," she snapped, her voice losing all pretense of social grace. "Your father was a small-time contractor with no vision, no connections, no understanding of how real business works. Everything he has now exists because of my family's expertise and network." There it was. The truth she'd been hiding behind: careful language and social manipulation. Dad wasn't her partner. He was her project. His success wasn't collaborative. It was orchestrated. His company wasn't his own. It was a subsidiary masquerading as independence. "You're absolutely right," I said, stepping closer to where Vivian stood rigid with fury. "Dad didn't understand how your kind of business works. He didn't realize that grief makes people vulnerable to exploitation. He didn't know that someone could use love as a cover for acquisition." I reached into my purse and pulled out the letters Mrs. Whitfield had given me, my mother's words written during her final weeks. But my mother understood. She wrote letters warning about exactly this kind of situation. Letters that Dad never received because they were hidden from him after her death. The gasps from the audience were audible now, the kind of collective intake of breath that comes when a story takes a turn no one had anticipated. I held up one of the letters, its blue ribbon still tied around the others. She wrote, "Thomas is a good man with a generous heart, but grief will make him vulnerable to people who mistake kindness for weakness. If someone ever tries to convince him that his own judgment isn't good enough, that he needs sophisticated help to be successful, I hope someone who loves him will remind him of his own worth." Dad had gone completely still, staring at the letters, as if seeing ghosts made manifest. "Your mother wrote those for you?" "She wrote them for both of us," I replied. "Instructions for protecting each other from exactly what's been happening here." I turned back to Vivian, who was now standing like a statue of barely controlled rage. "You targeted a grieving widower, convinced him that his small-town values weren't sophisticated enough for real success, and then systematically transferred control of everything he'd built to your family's business interests. You used romance as a weapon and grief as leverage. The journalist who had spoken earlier was now moving through the crowd with her recorder, clearly recognizing that she'd stumbled onto a story far bigger than a simple business awards ceremony. Other guests were pulling out their phones, some recording video, others sending urgent texts to contacts who needed to hear about this development immediately. "This is ridiculous," Vivian said, but her voice lacked conviction now. "Thomas, tell them this is all nonsense. Tell them about our partnership, our success." Dad looked at her for a long moment, then at me, then at the room full of people who were waiting for his response. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but carried clearly through the silent ballroom. "I think," he said slowly, "it's time I understood exactly what I signed and exactly who I've been trusting with my family's future." He walked down from the stage, past Vivian, and stopped directly in front of me. "Riley, I need your help. Not as my daughter who should be grateful for what we've built, but as someone with the skills to figure out what we're really dealing with here." The transformation in the room was palpable. What had begun as a celebration of business success had become an investigation into business manipulation, and everyone present understood that they were witnessing the beginning of something that would have consequences far beyond this single evening. I looked at Dad, seeing him clearly for the first time since I'd come home. Not the stranger who'd been shaped by Vivian's influence, but the man who'd raised me to value truth over comfort and courage over convenience. "Then let's go find some answers," I said. The truth came in waves, each revelation more shocking than the last. We left the gala immediately, Dad driving in stunned silence while I sat in the passenger seat with my laptop open, accessing databases I'd hoped never to use for personal matters. The secure military networks that had served me overseas were now my weapons in a different kind of war. Back at the house, we spread documents across the dining room table like battlefield maps. The partnership agreements Elena had photographed were worse than I'd initially understood. Dad hadn't just given Harrison and Associates consulting authority. He'd essentially signed over ownership rights that would transfer automatically under certain conditions. "Look at this clause," I said, pointing to a section buried in legal terminology. "If Carter Construction fails to meet performance benchmarks for 3 consecutive quarters, operational control transfers entirely to the consulting partner." Dad stared at the document, his face growing paler. "But we've been meeting all our targets." "Have you?" I pulled up the financial reports I'd accessed through government contracting databases. "Because, according to federal records, Carter Construction has been operating at a loss for the past 8 months. The only thing keeping you profitable is management fees being paid by Harrison and Associates." The full picture was breathtaking in its cynicism. Vivian's family had structured the relationship so that Dad's company would inevitably fail the benchmark tests, triggering the ownership transfer clauses. They were paying him enough to maintain the lifestyle that kept him compliant while ensuring his business would eventually belong to them entirely. "There's more," I continued, accessing another database. "The government contracts you've been winning? They're all structured as cost-plus agreements where Harrison and Associates receives the majority of the profit through consulting fees and administrative overhead." I showed him a breakdown that revealed the truth. Dad's company was essentially a front operation, legitimate enough to win contracts but structured to benefit Vivian's family while leaving him dependent on their continued support. The sound of a car in the driveway interrupted our investigation. Through the window, I watched Vivian emerge from her Mercedes, her face set in lines of fury that I'd never seen before. She marched toward the house with the determination of someone coming to settle accounts. She burst through the front door, without knocking, her evening gown now looking like a costume from a performance that had ended badly. "Thomas, we need to talk. Now." Her eyes swept over the documents covering the table, and I saw the exact moment she realized how much we'd uncovered. "Actually," I said, standing to face her, "I think it's time for you to do the talking, starting with how much of this you planned before you ever met my father." Vivian's laugh was sharp, bitter. "You think you're so clever with your military training and your investigation skills, but you don't understand anything about the real world." "Then explain it to me," I challenged. "Explain how targeting a grieving widower and manipulating him into signing over his life's work qualifies as the real world." Her mask finally dropped completely. "Your father was nothing when I met him. A small-time contractor with no ambition, no vision, no understanding of how to build real wealth. I gave him everything he has now." "You gave him debt disguised as prosperity?" I countered. "You gave him contracts that enriched your family while bankrupting his company? You gave him a lifestyle he can't afford to maintain without your continued manipulation." Dad had been silent through this exchange, but now he spoke, his voice hollow with understanding. "The house, the cars, the country club membership. None of it's actually mine, is it?" Vivian's expression shifted to something approaching pity. "Thomas, darling, you couldn't afford any of this on your own. The loans, the financing arrangements, they're all structured through my family's holdings. Without our support, you'd lose everything within 6 months." "Because you designed it that way," I said. "You created a dependency that makes him afraid to question your decisions or challenge your authority." I pulled out the final document I'd discovered, the one that revealed the ultimate scope of their plan, including the life insurance policy that makes you the primary beneficiary of a business you systematically devalued. The silence that followed was deafening. Dad stared at Vivian as if seeing her for the first time, while she stared at me with naked hatred that she no longer bothered to disguise. "You have no proof of anything illegal," she said finally. "Everything we did was documented, legitimate, properly executed through legal channels." She was right, and we both knew it. The manipulation had been sophisticated enough to operate within legal boundaries while achieving completely unethical outcomes. But legality and legitimacy were different things, and I had one more card to play. The final card came in the form of a phone call at exactly 9:30 p.m., just as Vivian was gathering her purse to leave after her explosive confession. The caller ID showed a name that made my heart race. Colonel Patricia Webb, my former commanding officer's superior and the person who'd overseen the most sensitive government contracts I'd worked on overseas. "Riley Carter?" The voice was crisp, authoritative. "This is Colonel Webb. I understand you've been asking questions about Harrison and Associates and their government contracting practices." I glanced at Vivian, whose face had gone from anger to something approaching fear. "Yes, ma'am. I've uncovered some concerning patterns in their business relationships. I need you to know that Harrison and Associates is currently under federal investigation for contract manipulation and fraudulent partnership arrangements. We've been building a case for 18 months, and your father's company appears to be one of several small businesses that were systematically targeted." The words hit the room like a physical force. Dad sank into his chair while Vivian's face went completely white. "Colonel," I said, putting the call on speaker, "my stepmother is here. She might want to hear this directly." "Mrs. Carter," Colonel Webb's voice filled the dining room, "I need to inform you that your brother James Harrison is facing federal charges for conspiracy to defraud the government through manipulated contracting processes. Your father-in-law's business was identified as a victim of this scheme, not a participant." Vivian's composure cracked entirely. "That's impossible. James's business is completely legitimate. Everything we did was legal. Legal in structure, perhaps, but fraudulent in intent," Colonel Webb replied. "The investigation revealed that Harrison and Associates specifically targeted recently widowed business owners, using romantic relationships to gain access to their companies and manipulate them into disadvantageous partnerships. I felt a surge of vindication mixed with horror at how calculated the entire operation had been. "How many other families were targeted?" I asked. "At least 12 that we've identified so far. Your stepmother's pattern was remarkably consistent. Court vulnerable business owners, convince them to enter partnerships they didn't understand, and gradually transfer control to Harrison and Associates while maintaining the appearance of legitimate consultation." Dad finally found his voice. "So everything, the success, the contracts, the money, was built on a foundation of systematic fraud," Colonel Webb confirmed. "Mr. Carter, your original business was actually quite valuable. The contracts you were winning were legitimate, but the profit-sharing arrangements were designed to benefit the Harrison network while leaving you with unsustainable debt loads." Vivian backed toward the door, her face a mask of panic. "I had nothing to do with James's decisions. I was just trying to help Thomas build a better life." "Ma'am," Colonel Webb's voice turned stern, "we have recorded phone conversations between you and your brother discussing specific strategies for manipulating Mr. Carter's business decisions. Your romantic relationship was documented as part of the acquisition strategy. The truth hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. Everything about Dad's transformation, their relationship, the lifestyle changes, had been orchestrated as part of a federal fraud scheme. Vivian hadn't fallen in love with a grieving widower. She'd been assigned to him as a target. "There's one more thing," Colonel Webb continued. "Mr. Carter, our investigation revealed that your original partnership agreements contain clauses that are legally invalid due to fraudulent inducement. With proper legal representation, you can void these contracts and reclaim full control of your business." Dad's head snapped up. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means that everything they convinced you to sign was based on false premises and manipulated information. Your company, your assets, your financial arrangements, all of it can be restored to your control." I looked at Vivian, who was now pressed against the wall as if trying to disappear. "It also means," I said slowly, "that Dad owns 60% of everything that was acquired using his original business as collateral, including this house." Vivian's face went from white to gray. "That's not possible. The house was purchased through Harrison and Associates financing." "Financing that was secured using Dad's business assets," I replied. "Assets that were fraudulently transferred, which means the true ownership reverts to the original asset holder." Colonel Webb's voice cut through the tension. "Mrs. Carter, I need to advise you that federal agents will be contacting you within the next 48 hours regarding your participation in this scheme. You may want to consult with an attorney who specializes in federal fraud cases." The call ended, leaving the three of us in a silence that felt dense with the weight of revealed truth. Vivian stood frozen by the door, her carefully constructed world collapsing around her like a house of cards in a hurricane. "So," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system, "I think we need to discuss who actually doesn't belong here." Vivian's attempt to salvage the situation was both pathetic and revealing. She straightened her shoulders, smoothed her evening gown, and tried to summon the commanding presence that had controlled our household for 3 years. But the mask was irreparably cracked now, and every word that came out of her mouth only deepened the hole she'd dug for herself. "Thomas, you have to understand," she began, her voice taking on the pleading tone of someone who'd never had to beg for anything before. "Yes, James made some questionable decisions, but my feelings for you were always genuine. Everything I did was to help you succeed, to give you the life you deserved after Grace's death." The mention of my mother's name was like a physical slap. Dad's face hardened in a way I hadn't seen since I was a child being disciplined for serious misbehavior. "Don't," he said quietly. "Don't you dare use Grace's memory to justify what you've done to this family." I pulled out my phone and began recording, my military training kicking in with the instinct to document evidence when witnessing the collapse of a hostile operation. "For the record," I said, It's now 9:47 p.m. on Saturday evening, and Vivian Carter is attempting to minimize her participation in a federal fraud scheme after being directly implicated by military investigators. "You can't record me without my permission," Vivian snapped, but her legal knowledge was apparently as flawed as her business ethics. "Actually, I can," I replied. "South Carolina is a one-party consent state, and this conversation is taking place in my father's home regarding criminal activity that directly affected his assets." The sound of cars pulling into the driveway interrupted her response. Through the window, I could see two black sedans with government plates parking behind Vivian's Mercedes. Men in dark suits emerged from both vehicles, moving with the kind of purposeful efficiency that indicated this wasn't their first federal fraud arrest. "That was faster than expected," I murmured, ending the recording and pocketing my phone. Vivian's face went through a spectrum of emotions: confusion, realization, terror, and finally a kind of desperate calculation that suggested she was already planning her defense strategy. The doorbell rang with the crisp authority of people who weren't making a social call. Dad moved to answer it, his steps measured and deliberate like a man who'd finally found solid ground after years of walking on quicksand. "Mr. Carter? I'm Agent Rodriguez with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We need to speak with Mrs. Vivian Carter regarding an ongoing investigation into fraudulent government contracting practices." The agent's voice was professional, but carried undertones that suggested this wasn't going to be a brief conversation. Vivian's final play was perhaps the most revealing of all. Instead of maintaining her innocence or expressing shock at the accusations, she immediately shifted into damage control mode. "Gentlemen, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I'm prepared to cooperate fully with your investigation, including providing information about my brother's business practices that I was previously unaware of." She was throwing James under the bus before the agents had even finished reading her rights. The woman who'd spent 3 years positioning herself as the architect of Dad's success was now desperately trying to recast herself as another victim of her brother's schemes. "Ma'am," Agent Rodriguez replied, "we'll discuss your level of cooperation at the field office. Right now, I need to inform you that you're being arrested on suspicion of conspiracy to commit fraud against the United States government." The words hung in the air like a final verdict on 3 years of manipulation and lies. As the agents led Vivian toward the door in handcuffs, she turned back one last time. "Thomas, don't let them turn you against me. We built something beautiful together." But Dad didn't respond. He stood in the doorway watching the woman who'd systematically dismantled his independence being led away in federal custody, and for the first time since I'd come home, he looked like the man I remembered from before grief had made him vulnerable. When the cars disappeared down our driveway, we stood in the sudden quiet of our house, surrounded by evidence of manipulation, but finally free to determine what came next. 6 months later, I stood in the same kitchen where Vivian had once handed me eviction papers, but everything had changed. The marble countertops were gone, replaced with the butcher block surfaces Mom had always preferred. Dad's construction company, now fully under his control again, was thriving with legitimate contracts and honest partnerships. The federal investigation had concluded with James Harrison receiving a 10-year sentence and Vivian pleading guilty to conspiracy charges in exchange for 5 years and full restitution. The house was officially ours again, the debt cleared, and Dad's confidence restored along with his assets. "Morning, sweetheart," Dad said, pouring coffee from Mom's old percolator that we'd retrieved from storage. "Ready for your first day as business partner?" The partnership was real this time, built on trust instead of manipulation. My military logistics experience perfectly complemented Dad's construction expertise, and we'd already won 3 major contracts based on our combined qualifications. Mrs. Whitfield appeared at the kitchen window, tending her roses and waving cheerfully. She'd become more than a neighbor. She was family now, keeping Mom's memory alive while celebrating our new beginning. I pulled out my phone and opened the news app, where a headline caught my attention. Federal Task Force expands. Investigation into romance-based business fraud. Our story had helped expose a nationwide scheme that had victimized dozens of families, leading to prosecutions across multiple states. "Dad," I said, showing him the article, "we did more than save our family. We helped save others too." He smiled, the genuine expression I remembered from childhood. "Your mother would be proud. She always said the best way to heal from trauma is to prevent it from happening to someone else." As I headed to our newly legitimate office, I thought about the young veteran who'd stepped off that Greyhound bus feeling unwelcome in her own home. She'd discovered that sometimes you don't belong because someone else is trying to steal the place where you should be standing. The fight to reclaim what's rightfully yours isn't just about ownership. It's about dignity, truth, and the courage to stand up when everything seems lost. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories of courage, justice, and the power of never giving up on family. Your support helps us share these important stories with people who need to hear them.